Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer with the Global National Security Institute, GNSI, here at the University of South Florida. As always, I'm joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired U.S. Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, as we explore global and national security issues. What's Really Happening will take you behind the scenes and open the door to the insights, knowledge, and experiences of a senior leader who's commanded at the highest levels of the U.S. military, including commanding U.S. Central Command. The war in Ukraine really started back in 2014 in the aftermath of the Euromaidan protest that disposed the Ukrainian government of the pro-Russian leader Viktor Yanukovych. This unrest led to Russia using its little green men to occupy Crimea and then later annex the region. In the spring of 2014, unrest in the Donbas led to multiple battles across the region, with sniper fire and artillery exchanges simmering in the region all the way up until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. As the conflict drags on until its 10th year, and 2 years since the full-scale invasion by Russian forces, we turn it over to General McKenzie for his insights about the war. Well, welcome back, General.
Tad, it's always good to be with you.
So before we jump into what's currently going on the battlefield, let's look at your career, your 42 years in the Marine Corps as an officer. During the course of that career, did you interact with Europe and then particularly Ukraine, if at all?
So I had a little unusual career path for a Marine in that much of my experience was in the Atlantic. Most Marines tend to spend a lot of their time in the Pacific and in the Western Pacific, and I certainly spent a share of my time there. But I was very lucky to do a major exercise in NATO, for example, in 1987, I believe. Okay. What we called a Northern Wedding Bowl Guard. As a young captain, I was a company commander. We landed in Norway, then went down and did an assault crossing of the Kiel Canal. Wow. And operated in south of Regensburg and in northern Germany. And for a variety of reasons, I just had the opportunity to go to Europe quite a bit. And so I kept a strong interest in it, as well as the opportunity to travel there, perhaps a little more than most Marines.
Well, that's fascinating. And I'm sure that obviously Europe was kind of fading in significance in many ways in the post-Cold War era after the 1980s, but has obviously resurged with actions in the East. So in 2014, we're coming up on the anniversary of the invasion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In 2014, though, is really when the conflict started. Do you remember where you were and what your thoughts are on the conflict?
Sure. I was just leaving headquarters Marine Corps, left headquarters Marine Corps in the spring of 2014, went down to Central Command to get a 3rd star and become the Central Marine Forces Central Command commander. So I watched it with great interest. It's hard to get good reporting on it from where I was, but I was very interested in what was happening there and followed it with pretty closely, actually.
Was there any concern during that time of what Russia was going to, how Russia was going to interact with Europe, but also what if it was going to push into the Middle East at all?
I think we were very worried about what Russia would do after chewing off a part of Crimea and turning further into the west. At the same time, you may recall the Russians established their base in western Syria, and that was something that we spent a lot of time looking at. So we tended to evaluate Russian actions more in light of what it meant from their base at Hmeimim, which is in western Syria, and how that was linked to what was happening in Crimea. There was once a thought that they had actually established the base in western Syria, eventually to use it as a bargaining chip to take pressure off Crimea. I think events overtook them and it went a different way, but we always speculated there might have been a linkage there.
Right, because you have the annexation of Crimea in early 2014. Then you have the conflict flaring up in the Donbas in eastern Ukraine. Then Russia establishes a base in Syria. And then you have in 2015, you actually have a Russian jet getting shot down by Turkey in the Middle East. Did that have any, did that spike any concerns at the command?
Yeah, we watched it. Again, we watched it pretty closely because anytime someone shoots, an aircraft down, the possibility of escalation is very, very real. In that case, it did not happen, which is a little surprising, but I think cooler heads prevailed. But it was certainly a spike in tension during that period of time.
Right, and as the war in Ukraine continued from 2015 until the invasion of 2022, it kind of simmered. There was some artillery exchanges, sniper fire. There's a lot of trench digging, mine laying. Was there anything particular during that period that your career intersected with the conflict?
Not really. During that period, Tad, I was principally focused on the Middle East. So we looked at, and I tended to evaluate Russian actions based on what it meant in the region, particularly in Syria, but in other areas across the region as well. And we tried to think, again, if there was a linkage to what was going on up there in Crimea. Not particularly. I was never able to deduce it.
Okay, interesting. And then now we're sitting here over 2 years after the invasion. Why do you think Russia decided to escalate the conflict in a sense? So you have this frozen conflict from 2015 to 2022, and then Russia decides to invade in February.
Well, I think Putin perhaps thought that Ukraine would not get backing from the West. He had seen what had happened to us in Afghanistan. He might have drawn some conclusions about our ability to assemble a coalition and to stand in there over that. And it might have made him a little overconfident. But I also think, Putin has a messianic personality. He really believes that, I believe when he says it, he actually believes it, that Ukraine is properly a part of Russia and needs to be returned to Russia, as perhaps other elements that are now NATO states that might face this risk in the future.
Well, as we look at the lead up to the invasion, so is it a failure of deterrence overall from the West, do you think, that allowed Putin to think that?
So I think, first of all, our president did a very good thing and a very, I think, actually courageous thing in that we declassified some very sensitive material to demonstrate to the world that Putin was actually going to launch an invasion. Because you may be aware, Ted, the Ukrainians actually were not completely bought into the idea that they were going to be invaded. Many other states had the same opinion. But what the president did was he allowed us to look at very sensitive material and to share that with those countries so they could gain an appreciation that, yes, this attack was going to come. At the same time, it allowed him to try to deter Putin from acting by saying, look, we know this is going to happen. We're going to stand up to you. Now, he did not believe that to be the case. And as you know, deterrence is compounded of capability and will.
Right.
I think they probably had a reasonably healthy respect for our capability and not much respect for our will. And that was further amplified, again, by what had just happened in Afghanistan.
Right, because if you look over the arc of the last decade and a half or so, you have the Russian invasion of Georgia, only gets minimal sanctions from the West, and then you have a reset 2 years later.
That's right.
And then you have the annexation of Crimea, some sanctions, and then relations kind of normalize again, despite the simmering frozen conflict in the East. So was Putin getting missed signals, perhaps?
I think totalitarian states tend to push until they find something that pushes back against them. So nothing was pushing back against him.
Right.
So there's a fairly reasonable deduction for him to assume that there wouldn't be a lot of support for Ukraine. And he was wrong, of course.
Right.
And that's another thing I think that the response of the United States has been magnificent here. It allowed us to sort of reset the table after Afghanistan to prove that we can, in fact, assemble a coalition, a global coalition, in the face of naked, unprovoked, reckless aggression.
And so when we talk about this unprovoked aggression, what's the U.S. interest particularly in this conflict? I'm sure there's a number of different things the U.S. wants to forward. Obviously, it wants to support the Ukrainian effort, make sure that Russia's punished for its illegal actions. But where does that go further?
Well, I think we never want to be in a position where strong states are going to be able to overpower their weak neighbors. Because if you are, then where does it end?
Right.
After Ukraine, what's next? And so I think there's a very compelling reason in statecraft to not reward this kind of behavior and in fact act against it, not only for the United States, but more particularly for those nation states in NATO and Europe that are so much closer to the potential Russian threat.
Right, right. Well, and that goes back to, like we were saying, where Russia had done some of these actions, in a sense, got a slap on the hand from the community. And finally, like you said, we could a full bunch of larger.
Well, the problem with confronting a tyrant is it's always better to do it earlier.
Right.
We chose not to do so with Hitler, and we had many opportunities in the 1930s to confront Hitler. We chose not to do that until we had to fight a global war against it. And the same lesson can be applied here. We could have done a lot of things much earlier to perhaps dissuade Putin from adopting the reckless course that he's chosen to take. We did not choose to follow any of those approaches, and now we're in a pretty difficult, dangerous situation.
Right, and so the failure of deterrence, and again, using sanctions to deter, which obviously did not deter that much. In 2021, Russia has a major military buildup in April timeframe on the Ukrainian border. And a lot of people watched that, and then they ended up pulling those troops away. But there wasn't a major Western response to that. There wasn't any additional sanctions. There were some news outlets covered. And then Putin publishes his article where you mentioned, he says the Ukrainian people are Russian people. And as you get into the winter of 2021, we start seeing this other buildup of Russian forces on the border. During that time, do you recall what your thoughts were on why that was happening?
Well, first of all, the Russian buildup of forces is age-old, it's cyclical, it's deeply rooted in what I would call the Russian approach to war. In the 70s and 80s in Europe, the Russians, and what we call the Group of Soviet Forces Germany, the GSFG, would assemble their combat power and the combat power of their Warsaw Pact comrades, and they would move close to the border and deploy in offensive formations, and then they'd go back. There's usually the culmination of a training exercise, but it also desensitizes the observer a little bit to these types of exercise, when they always tend to end with everybody going back to their barracks. But the Russians have always used that kind of a technique. It's what allows you to marshal and get your forces ready to go without being seen or without giving undue warning to the other side. Now, in this case, our intelligence was good. We saw the forces coming together. It was very clear that they were actually planning to launch that attack in the spring of 22. And we, as we've already noted earlier, we shared that intelligence widely with our friends in the region, our allies and friends in the region. We also were very direct, I believe, with President Putin, telling him this is not what you want to do. We're not going to allow this aggression to stand. So there's where deterrence failed. He did not believe we would have the will to actually do it. And he had some reason for doing that, for thinking that, because of what had happened, of course, in Afghanistan just shortly before. So you can understand a little bit of Putin's mindset here as he went into this fight.
Yeah, my miscalculation. And I was on the ground in Ukraine, part of the Florida National Guard Advisory Task Force then, and the feeling on the ground was very mixed amongst our partners and allies about what was going to happen. Because when you looked at the numbers of troops on the border, it was actually a relatively small number for the amount of land they would have to occupy and keeping the population under control. Do you have any theories on why that was so small?
Sure. So I think the operation itself was poorly planned. I'm not certain that the Russian general staff was actively engaged in the planning. I think it may have been planned by organs of state security rather than by the uniformed military. And they didn't adhere to one thing the Russians have understood very well and they're masters of is what we would call deep operations theory. The idea that you're going to break through and insert forces into the enemy's depth. You need to have massive, overwhelming fire superiority, combat superiority at the point of attack. 6-1, 7-1, 9-1, which requires vast massing. By the end of the Second World War, the Russian Army, the Red Army, were the unexampled masters of that. They did not bring those lessons forward to now. And so you're right. I think the correlation of forces, as they would say, was not good. But it rose from a misreading of how the Ukrainians would defend themselves, which goes back to an intelligence failure. You know, kind of strangely, if you reverse the roles a little bit, sort of the mistake Hitler made when he invaded Russia in June of 1941. He had a false view of Soviet capabilities. He had a false view of the strength of the Soviet state. Part of that came from his misread of what happened to the Red Army in Finland in 1939 and 1940. Part of it came from the failure of his own intelligence services. But he also had a very poor force-to-space ratio as they went into Russia, and it only grew as that theater widened as you drove deeper into Russia. Exactly the same thing has sort of happened to Putin here. I think he misread the character of the Ukrainians. I think and also some extraordinarily shoddy operational and tactical planning by the forces that were there. You know, we all remember the vast tank formation north of Kyiv that ran out of gas. That's a fundamental element. That's a fundamental example of malpractice. And it's hard to believe that those Russian soldiers were the heirs to the Red Army of 1944 and 1945, where that would not have happened.
Well, and could this be blamed on the lack of experience again for the Red Army? Because other than really Afghanistan in the 1980s and then some smaller wars in Chechnya, they just don't have the operational experience?
Great question, Tad. And I think it's probably a combination of all those things. I think they have not had the opportunity to train to that standard large unit maneuver. They've been doing other things. Additionally, I think there's a long history in the Russian army of not having the NCOs and the young officers, and they are the people that actually make it all happen.
Absolutely.
And so if you don't have those kind of people there, it's hard for those formations to work. To go back to the tanks example, I've commanded tanks. I have a secondary specialty as a tank officer. And when I commanded tanks, every moment of my day was spent worrying about refueling those tanks. An M1 at maneuvering, you're going to have to refuel those guys 2 or 3 times a day. So I first thing in the morning, last thing at night, I was thinking about refueling. And because I thought about it all the time, we were able to work that complex ballet where what we would call your combat trains come forward. You know, you resupply your tanks, you refuel your tanks, you rearm your tanks so that you can continue to move. We are the best in the world at it, and we're the best in the world at it because we have young sergeants and young lieutenants who know how to make all this happen. It's not general's business. It's actually at the nitty-gritty edge where these types of things happen.
Right, because the Russian structure is really top-down driven. The officers really driving.
Always has been top-down driven and always has had a gap at that final level of application, and it was really nakedly exposed in going into Ukraine.
So Russia doesn't mobilize as many forces as we might have seen. Obviously, now they know they probably could have used more. Do you think that was also for the domestic audience, that Putin didn't want to do any major mobilizations and spark any domestic unrest?
I think you're right. I think Putin ultimately has to look to his domestic flank, which is why they've tended to obfuscate and cover up the number of casualties they've taken in this fight as well, and to generally minimize, the expense of the fight, which has been very expensive, both in human, material, and financial terms for Russia.
As we look at 2022, the invasion starts. They try to take Kyiv. The Russians fail. They pull back into Belarus and reestablish a line that pretty much is where it's at now in the east. So is this now more so a war of attrition, a trench warfare? Is there any possibility of it going back to a maneuver war, do you think?
Well, it's always easy to defend. And it's easier to defend when you have vast amounts of mines that you can deploy without concern for where they go or what they do. I'm sure a lot of these Russian minefields aren't mapped. And probably a lot of them have been spread by cluster munitions that the Russians have employed with a very high dud rate. So I think they've established that position. We've seen the Ukraine on the other side. I think they failed to learn some lessons too. If you want to break through, you have to mass. And if you mass, you have to accept risk. Risk is ultimately, in a war like this, a political decision. For example, you might have to give up defending some areas of a very long front. If you want to gain that 6-to-1, 9-to-1 combat ratio, you need to have, if you're going to break through a fortified belt. After combat in the built-up area, the most difficult military operation is actually fighting through a minefield, breaking through, creating a gap that your forces can then go through to exploit into depth. Hard to do that. The Ukrainians were unable to do it in this most recent offensive.
And it seems like the Russians are making slow gains in some areas in the east, but for the most part, it seems like that's holding the line.
Well, I think the Russians they've massed a lot of people. They finally getting their. I think they're getting their armaments a little. The flow of armaments to the force is a little better than it was at the beginning. A little better late than never if you're a Russian, I guess. And I think the Ukrainians are also beginning to see shortages of ammunition and other things, all of which tend to work against them.
So now that the line's been stagnant for almost over a year now, there's some small back and forth between the two sides. One of the strategies that Russia has employed is threats of nuclear attack or maneuvering nuclear weapons into Belarus and other areas. So what role do nuclear weapons play here? And then obviously the recent rumors or reporting that Russia's put a nuclear weapon into space and these things.
Nuclear weapons have always been a seamless part of Russian military doctrine. They think about nuclear weapon employment far more thoroughly than we do, actually. And they have lots of tactical nuclear weapons. We have very few tactical nuclear weapons. So the Russians have always considered nuclear weapons an essential part of warfare. Whatever they say at the highest levels, their doctrine it features seamless flow to the use of nuclear weapons should they choose to do that. So in this case, of course, President Putin has chosen to signal politically with a threat of nuclear weapon employment. You're right, they brought tactical nuclear weapons up into Belarus. No reason to do that. There's no tactical reason to do that. At the time they did it, I thought they might have been trying to manufacture an incident that would then allow them to do something else. I don't think the Russians are on the point of using a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. I think it's possible they would display one somewhere, maybe use it, fire a test shot somewhere that we could see it. And that brings us to what you brought up last, which is the possibility of Russian employment of nuclear weapons in space. Look, the Russians have thought long and hard about nuclear weapons in space. Many people don't remember a thing called FOBS, Fractional Orbital Bombardment System. The Russians experimented with this in the 1960s, which actually calls for placing weapons on orbit that would attack the United States over the South Pole in a very different approach. So the Russians have done a lot of thinking on this. They had technical difficulties with it. The Chinese have been tinkering with it more recently. But the Russians, they've studied the use of nuclear weapons in space. Nothing the Russians would do in space would surprise me. And their willingness to break international accords, we know, is they break them as easy as ice cream melts in the sun.
That's pretty quick.
That's pretty quick.
So to wrap up this concept of nuclear weapon use, do you see nuclear weapons or the threat of their use playing any additional role in this conflict as we kind of look forward?
I don't think so, except to signal.
Right.
I mean, it's hard for me to see the Russians using it on the battlefield, but I could be wrong. I think a radiological incident is possible, something involving one of the many nuclear plants that are up and down the Dnieper there where they could do something like that. And of course, there's a great history of that with Chernobyl there.
Right.
So I think those are likely. I think right now it's less likely that a tactical nuclear weapon would be used. It's possible, more likely, that a weapon could be used to signal something politically. And that I think is a very real possibility. I'm less, especially if the Russians begin to believe that things are going their way. They're not going to need to use a nuclear weapon. Right. So I think right now the odds of tactical use is low. The odds of it as some kind of a political signal, certainly within the realm of the possible.
Interesting. So now that we have the nuclear weapons touched on, we've touched on the conventional battlefield again, pretty much a 600-mile long front line that's stabilized for the most part, a little back and forth. What role has aid played from the West for the Ukrainians? So we're talking about aid from the U.S., from Germany, obviously NATO allies and others. What role is that playing leading up till now?
Well, it's been critical. Ukraine could not have survived without the massive infusion of aid that we've given them. Everything from vehicles to ammunition, above all ammunition, to drone systems, to other things that we've given Ukrainians. Without our support, Ukraine would not exist as a free nation today. And so that's why this concern about how much the U.S. is going to give going forward is significant. I believe if we fail to give them aid, Ukraine's going to find it very hard to survive on the battlefield. Because the Russians are beginning to hit their stride a little bit. They've hung around long enough. Massive infusion of support from Iran, probable infusion of support from North Korea. And then their own war machine is finally getting untracked in its ability to generate equipment and ammunition at a greater scale than Ukraine can, because look at the size of the two countries. Russia has a vastly larger armaments industry than Ukraine does, which is a very nascent industry and is almost wholly dependent upon external sources for its weapons.
Right, and the Russians have a bigger war chest.
All of those things apply. So Ukraine's ability to hold out will be a direct result of our continuation of aid.
When it goes back to the discussion on logistics as well, in this case, manufacturing, and you see like in World War II or other major wars, it takes a couple of years before countries really start getting their max output.
That's correct. And we have not particularly ramped up. We've done a little bit. I think the Russians have been more aggressive in doing that. They also labor under some problems in doing it, but I think they're actually doing surprisingly well given the sanctions that we've applied to them.
Do you see Iranian aid to Russia or North Korean aid that tipping the scale at all? Is that just more just basic?
I think Iranian drones have been hugely successful and hugely helpful to Russia. I'm not sure about North Korean equipment. I think North Koreans giving them ammunition, things of that nature. I don't know the details of that. But I think what has been very helpful to the Russians has been Iranian drones.
Sure. And obviously the Ukrainians have been using drones as well, and that's been a big key part on the battlefield. How do you see drone warfare evolving? So obviously your time as a CENTCOM commander, drones were used in the Middle East, but how do you see this conventional style war and drones playing in that?
What it's done is it democratizes the battlefield a little bit. It used to be that the United States had unquestioned air supremacy. Now a U.S. soldier in the Middle East or a Ukrainian soldier in Ukraine has to recognize that there will be platforms overhead that are not friendly. And we're not going to be able to control all those platforms. And some of those platforms may be lethal. And we just need to be aware of that. That's a change. I don't believe, as some have said, that the tank is dead, that armored formations are dead, because I think right now they're vulnerable. They've been vulnerable before. We managed to compensate for that. I think protected maneuver on the battlefield, particularly if you're going to break through an armored belt, a defended belt, I should say, a mined belt, you're going to have protected maneuver in order to do that. So that's not going away. But what you have to do is you have to prevent your high-value assets like tanks, armored personnel carriers, breaching vehicles, and tank recovery vehicles. You can't allow them to be taken out by small drones. And so we will. That right now, I believe, is probably the advantage lies with the drones. I predict that won't be forever, and very fast that scale will tip, and you'll find a way to protect these vehicles more effectively.
Right. And that's the same thing with the Javelin, the smaller handheld missiles that are destroying multi-million-dollar tanks. It starts becoming pretty costly for the people losing their tanks. So now that we're looking at the conflict now, but going forward, what does winning look like for the Ukrainians at this point? What can they expect to win? And they're about to start another mobilization. Western aid is starting to become questionable. Where do the Ukrainians go to get a win?
So unless Western aid continues on the scope and scale that's had been up into this time, the possibility of another Ukrainian offensive is almost negligible. So if they get aid, if we continue to support them, then I think the Ukrainians will think about maybe another summer offensive. They need to learn some lessons from the last one. They need to find an area that they want to have success in and attack in that area. And they'll have a lot more experience with the M1 tank and the other very good tanks that they have. They'll have more fighter aircraft. And it's not just the fighter aircraft, it's the whole system of air command and control that comes with those fighter aircraft that would be available to them. So I think those things, if properly supported, give them an opportunity this summer. If not, they're going to be strictly on the defensive. So then you have to look at what I would call a minimalist solution for Ukraine, where you're going to have to face the reality that you may have to give up territory to Russia.
And right now, their talking points are pretty clear that they're not.
Their talking points are pretty clear, and if I were Ukrainian, those would be my talking points too.
Yeah, of course.
But the battlefield has a way of imposing reality on statesmen's dreams.
Right. That the reality is on the battlefield.
That's right.
Not on the podium. So what's it look like on the other side? What do you think a win would look like for Russia, assuming maybe they can't take all of Ukraine? But
right, I think they've already taken a substantial fraction of Ukraine. So I think Putin would like to. I think he here's the problem with a dictator: they always want more.
Right.
So what may appear to be you and I to be a reasonable game solution to the problem may not fit for a guy who's a totalitarian leader, needs to protect his political flanks in Russia, always needs to be seen as the unquestioned strong leader. Enough may not be enough.
Right.
And typically, that has often been the downfall of these kinds of dictators.
Sure. Right, because he needs to win not just on the battlefield, but also for his domestic audience, because one, he started the war.
He cannot afford to look weak, and now things are turning. So, if you wanted a reasonable solution, you say, well, maybe we've got enough here. Let's freeze it. We'll come back in another year or two. I don't know that that's going to be his approach.
Right. And in both of those winning scenarios, the underlying key was time. This doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. Both are playing for
both are playing for the long haul. Let's see what happens in the next 90 days, 120 days. We need to assess: are we going to support Ukraine? Are they going to continue to get the support from the United States? Because without it, they're going to be in trouble. What's that going to mean? And then once you've got that sort of broad understanding of the two big branches forward, what are the Ukrainians going to do?
So what's your prediction as of right now based on the situation in the near term and in long term?
I think the Russians are going to keep nibbling away. And I think the Ukrainians are good fighters. Right. They're now clearly on the defensive, and the initiative has shifted to the Russians. The question will be, can the Russians take advantage of that and regain the capabilities that the Red Army once had? I see nothing to indicate to me they're going to be able to do that. But still, there's just a lot of Russians there, a lot of armor, a lot of artillery, and that sort of has a profound weight on the battlefield. On the other hand, the Russians have not been as good attacking as they have been defending, and we need to recognize that as well.
And so, speaking of what they've been good at, what they need to learn, what are the lessons that Russia can take away from this conflict right now? What do they need to learn?
They need to learn that they need to destroy the alliance that confronts them. You do that by thinking globally, not just tactically. And the Russians are very good at that. You want to find ways to sow disinformation. You want to get it back at the roots. You want to attack the political system of the United States, the political systems of our allies, to produce fractures that will ultimately yield less support for Ukraine. That's the lesson learned.
Right.
And they have actually learned that lesson very well.
Well, they've tried to do that with their hybrid warfare methods, cyber attacks, these misinformation.
Yep.
Luckily for us, NATO and the U.S. has worked on some countermeasures to try to get to fight back. What about the Ukrainians? What are their lessons learned of these? Well, really almost 10 years of war.
Yeah. So I think the last campaign, viewed objectively, you can't view it as a success. You've got to learn from that. Again, you can't attack everywhere. You can't be strong everywhere.
Right. Yeah.
Particularly when you're the weaker force, you have to the principle of mass, the principle of war of mass. You have to take a look at that, which means you have to practice the corollary principle of war, economy of force, somewhere else. They go hand in hand. What you can't do is spread your forces across the front like you're spreading peanut butter on a sandwich.
Right.
You have to, and that means accepting risk. That is hard to do, particularly when it's your homeland. It's easy for me to sit here and talk to you about it, but now we're talking about homes, villages, cities in Ukraine that you might be forced to give up in order to gain a tactical advantage somewhere else on the battlefield.
Right, you have to cede land for victory.
I don't want to minimize the difficulty of those decisions.
Yes, absolutely. It's very hard. You're ceding villages and cities for an attack somewhere else.
That's right.
And that's definitely hard to do. How about for the West, and particularly the U.S. and its allies? What do they need to walk away from this conflict so far?
Well, I think I go back to the alliance structure. Look, it's been a win for NATO. Sweden and Finland are now entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's a stunning geopolitical reversal for Russia. Stunning. That we don't yet, it's hard to even characterize how big a deal that is. People that haven't studied this for many years don't really know just how much that hurts Russia. So there's a huge win there. The importance of alliances, the importance of alliance structures, the importance of alliance management. You're always better when you fight as a group, when you have a shared, you hope that everyone has the same values. If you can't all have the same values, you at least have the same interests going forward. So the big takeaway is we have to preserve this remarkable coalition the most successful coalition really in the history of the world, I believe, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Right, because with the addition of Sweden and Finland, you pretty much turned the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, and that's where St. Petersburg is and Kaliningrad. So the Russians are not happy about that, I'm sure.
They are not happy, and it boomeranged in their face. And so that's a massive failure. And again, it's difficult to overstate the importance of that defeat for them.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll be feeling the strategic repercussions for a long time.
Absolutely.
And then lastly, what has China learned from this conflict? So they've condemned it for in so many words, but
so I think China has got to sit back and worry about alliance structures that confront them because they have none. So they've got to consider that. They've seen an alliance structure at work here, and it's performed pretty well. That's number one. Number two, I think they've got to consider the capabilities of their own military. In many ways, they have a lot of similarity to the Russian military. And they also have not fought in a long, long time, and they have significant political interference with the operation of their forces. So all of those things, I would think, tend to make the Chinese sit back and worry just a little about the machine they have created.
Right. So it's not propelling them for an invasion of Taiwan. It's more of a reflection.
I think that they're gonna have to think about it.
Right. And then what's the relationship with Russia and China as this war goes on? So Russia, in a sense, in the war footing, but in some ways spending a lot of money and maybe getting more dependent on China.
It's strictly a relationship of need. There's no ultimate community of interest here. I don't know how long it will last. I don't think it's a true strategic partnership. But increasingly, China is becoming the dominant party, and Russia is becoming the subordinate party. And that must rankle Mr. Putin pretty badly, considering with the loss of Finland and Sweden.
And then lastly, as we look at this war and we come out of it with a peace agreement or it's a frozen conflict, what does that mean for Europe? A lot of European leaders are saying, Russia could rebuild in 5 years and then be a threat to, be a significant threat to NATO again. So what does the European security environment look like when this war ends?
Well, so NATO has to prepare for a long period of confrontation with Russia. That's the key thing. And the big question for NATO will be, what kind of a partner will the United States be in that regard?
Right. So is it a new Cold War then with the Russians?
I think we're in a Cold War with Russia now, at least in Europe, and it's a hot war in some places, as you know. So I think we need to be prepared for a long period of confrontation with Russia and Europe.
So you see great power competition being the mainstay between Russia, China, and the U.S. In the end.
I think we're in that domain already.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, General.
Thanks, Tad. I always enjoy these.